In today's video, we're diving into the fascinating world of medieval beauty, covering the trends, the rituals, and the strange expectations that defined attractiveness back then, and how some of them still influence us today. If you enjoy uncovering hidden history like this, make sure to hit that like button. Drop a comment telling us which era you want us to explore next, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a story. And stick around until the end. You might never look at beauty standards the same way again. Now, let's step back in time. Ever wondered what people considered beautiful hundreds of years ago? Not just the fancy dresses or shining armor, but the actual beauty standards people lived by, what made someone attractive, admired, or even powerful in medieval times. Because here's the surprising part. Some of those standards were very different from what we see today. Pale skin was prized, certain body shapes were idealized, and in some cases, people even changed their appearance in ways that might sound shocking now. Picture this. It is very late at night. A small stone room glows with soft candlelight. The walls are cold, but the air is warm from the flame. Somewhere outside, you can hear the quiet shuffle of guards changing watch. Inside, everything feels still. A young noblewoman sits in front of a polished piece of metal, the closest thing she has to a mirror. It does not reflect clearly. It never does. Her face looks a little warped, a little softer than it really is. But this is what she must rely on. She leans closer. Carefully, she lifts her hand and plucks a few strands of hair from her hairline, one by one. No rush. This is important. A higher forehead, after all, is considered elegant, intelligent, refined. Beauty in her world is not casual. It is something you work at, something you shape, something that can decide your future. She pauses, tilts her head, studies what she can see. But here's the strange part. She does not actually know what she truly looks like. Not really. There are no glass mirrors like we have today. No selfies, no photos, no quick glance in a bathroom mirror before heading out. Most people in the medieval world saw their own face only in blurred reflections water. Metal, maybe polished silver if they were wealthy. So instead of seeing themselves clearly, people depended on something else. Other people. Their idea of beauty was shaped by what others said, what others praised, what others judged. Beauty was not just personal, it was social, public, almost like a reputation you wore on your face. Now, when we think about medieval beauty today, we often imagine something very simple, maybe even a little rough. We think people were dirty, unkempt, not too concerned with looks. But that idea is not quite right. In reality, beauty mattered a lot, just not in the same way it does now. Because in the medieval world, beauty was never just about looking good. It was tied to something much deeper, something heavier. It was tied to meaning. To understand that, we need to let go of modern thinking for a moment. Today, beauty is often about self-expression, style, trends, personal taste. You might change your look because you feel like it, because it fits your identity, or just because it's fun. But back then, beauty was not just personal choice. It was a signal, a very loud one. Your appearance told people who you were, where you came from, and sometimes even what kind of person you were on the inside. If someone had pale skin, it didn't just mean they avoided the sun. It meant they likely had wealth, status, a life that kept them indoors, away from hard labor. If a woman covered her hair, it didn't just mean fashion. It could signal modesty, marriage, obedience to social and religious expectations. Even the shape of your face, or how you styled your hair, could carry meaning. And here's where things get even more interesting. Beauty was also tied to morality. People believed that the outside could reflect the inside, that physical appearance might reveal something about your soul. A person who looked pure might be seen as closer to goodness, to virtue, even to God. But at the same time, beauty could also be dangerous. Too much beauty could tempt, distract, lead others into sin. So there was this constant tension. Be beautiful, but not too beautiful. Look pleasing, but not vain. Care about your appearance, but not in a way that suggests pride. It's a bit like trying to walk a tightrope in the dark. One wrong step, and people might judge you harshly. And judgment, in medieval society, was not light. It could affect your chances of marriage, your reputation, your place in the community. In some cases, it could even affect your survival, because beauty was connected to status, and status, in the medieval world, meant everything. If you were born into a noble family, your appearance had to reflect that. You were expected to look a certain way, to carry yourself with grace, to present an image that matched your rank. If you were a peasant, your appearance told a different story. Sun-darkened skin, rough hands, practical clothing. Your beauty, if it was recognized at all, was often seen through a different lens. Health, strength, the ability to work. So already, we can see something important. There was no single standard of beauty. There were layers, class, religion, gender, all shaping what was considered attractive. And then there's one more thing to consider: time. Medieval beauty standards were not frozen. They shifted over centuries. What was admired in one period might not be admired in another. Styles changed. Ideals moved. But the deeper patterns stayed the same. Beauty was never just about the surface. It was about what the surface represented. Now, let's go back to our noblewoman for a moment. She finishes adjusting her hairline. She smooths her dress. Maybe she applies a bit of powder to her skin, hoping to make it look lighter, more delicate. She leans in again, trying to see herself more clearly in that imperfect reflection. But what she's really doing is not just looking. She's measuring. Am I refined enough? Do I look noble enough? Do I look good? Not just good in a modern sense, but good in the way her world understands it. Good in a way that fits expectations, that signals the right things. Because in her world, beauty is not just something you have, it's something you perform. And that performance is shaped by forces much bigger than her. Religion, society, class, tradition, all quietly guiding her hand as she plucks, adjusts, and examines, all telling her, in subtle ways, what she should be. So, when we ask what were beauty standards like in medieval times, we're not just asking about hairstyles or skin tone. We're asking about a whole system of meaning, a system where beauty could suggest purity or temptation, where a simple feature could hint at wealth or poverty, where the way you looked could influence how people treated you, trusted you, or even judged your soul. And once you start to see it this way, the medieval world feels a little less distant, because even now, in our modern lives, beauty still carries meaning. It still signals things, still shapes perception, still affects opportunity, just in different ways. So as we move forward, keep this in mind. We're not just exploring old beauty trends, We're stepping into a world where appearance was deeply connected to identity, belief, and survival. And in that world, something as simple as a forehead or a shade of skin could change everything. Now, let's gently widen the scene. Step outside that quiet chamber. Walk through narrow stone streets, past market stalls, past the smell of bread and smoke, past people going about their day, and rising above everything else. Is the church not just a building, but a presence? In medieval Europe, the Catholic Church was not simply part of life. It shaped life. It guided how people thought, how they behaved, and yes, even how they understood beauty. If you wanted to understand what was considered good or proper, you didn't look to fashion magazines or social media. You looked to religion, and religion had a lot to say. At first, it might seem like the church would not care much about beauty. After all, spiritual life was supposed to be about the soul, not the body. But that's exactly why beauty became complicated, because the body could not be ignored. It was always there, visible, present, and in many ways, it became a kind of symbol, a reflection of something deeper. The church often taught that the physical world was temporary, that true beauty was spiritual, not earthly. The soul mattered more than the face. But here's the twist: people still lived in bodies. They still saw each other, judged each other, formed opinions based on appearance. So instead of rejecting beauty entirely, the church helped shape how it should be understood, and this is where that quiet tension begins. On one side, beauty could be seen as a gift, something given by God, a sign of harmony, order, and divine creation. If someone was physically beautiful, it might suggest they were blessed, favored, aligned with something pure. But on the other side, beauty could also be dangerous, because it could lead to vanity. And vanity, in medieval thinking, was not just a small flaw. It was a serious moral issue. To care too much about your appearance could mean you were prideful, distracted from God, focused on the wrong things. So again, we see that balancing act. Be beautiful, but don't show that you're trying too hard. Look pleasing, but stay humble. It's almost like being told to shine, but quietly. Now, to understand this better, we need to look at one of the most powerful influences on medieval beauty ideals: the image of the Virgin Mary. Mary was not just a religious figure. She was a model, an ideal, a standard. She was often described and depicted as gentle, pure, calm, and modest. Her beauty was soft, not bold, quiet, not attention-seeking. This became the blueprint. Women were encouraged, in subtle and direct ways, to reflect these qualities, not just in behavior, but in appearance. A modest face, a calm expression-covered hair, nothing too flashy, nothing too loud, because beauty, in this context, was not meant to attract attention in a worldly way. It was meant to reflect inner virtue. Now imagine living in a world where your appearance might suggest your moral character, where looking too beautiful could raise suspicion, where attracting too much attention could be seen as a kind of risk. It changes how you present yourself. It changes how you think about even the smallest details. A hairstyle, a dress, a glance, all of it becomes meaningful. And then there's another layer, the idea of temptation. In medieval religious teaching, physical beauties, especially female beauty, was sometimes linked to the idea of leading others into sin. Not always, but often enough to matter. A beautiful woman could be admired, but also feared, because she might distract men from their spiritual duties, stir desire, create moral weakness. So again, beauty becomes complicated. It's admired, but also controlled, celebrated, but also watched carefully. And this didn't just affect women. Men, too, were expected to follow certain standards. A man should be clean, presentable, and respectable, but not overly concerned with his looks. Too much grooming could be seen as vanity, or worse, a sign of softness or lack of discipline. So the ideal man walked his own version of that same tightrope. Strong, but not arrogant. Well-kept, but not obsessed. Now let's return to daily life for a moment. Picture someone getting ready in the morning. They wash their face, adjust their clothes, maybe fix their hair, but in the back of their mind, there's always this quiet awareness. Am I doing too much? Am I crossing the line into vanity? Am I still humble? Because the church didn't just set rules. It shaped conscience. It created an inner voice that people carried with them. A voice that whispered reminders about modesty, humility, and self-control. And over time, these ideas became part of the culture itself, even outside of direct religious settings. So beauty standards were not just enforced from the outside. They were internalized. People began to believe them deeply. Now, here's something important to understand. The church did not create a single, fixed list of beauty rules. It wasn't that simple. Instead, it created a framework, a way of thinking, a system where beauty had to be balanced with morality, where appearance had to align with virtue, and within that framework, different trends and preferences could exist, but they always had to fit within those boundaries. So when a noble woman adjusted her hairline, or chose a certain style of dress, she wasn't just thinking about fashion. She was navigating a moral landscape, trying to look appropriate, respectable, acceptable, trying to fit into a world where beauty was never just about the surface. And this is what makes medieval beauty so fascinating. It wasn't free. It wasn't purely creative. It was guided, shaped, sometimes even restricted, by forces that reached far beyond the mirror. So as we move into the next chapters, into pale skin, hair, body shape, and all the details we need to remember this foundation, because every standard we're about to explore, every trend, every practice, every strange or surprising detail exists within this larger system, a system where beauty was always connected to something deeper, something moral, something spiritual, something that people believed could reflect not just who you were, but who you were becoming. Now let's move a little closer to the face, the skin, the details people noticed first. Because if there was one feature that stood above almost all others in the medieval world, it was this: pale skin, not just slightly fair, but noticeably, deliberately pale. The kind of skin that seemed untouched by the sun, soft, light, almost glowing in candlelight. Today, depending on where you are in the world, people might want a tan, a bit of sun-kissed color, something that suggests travel, leisure, time outdoors. But in medieval Europe, that idea would feel completely backwards, because the sun told a story, and it was not the story you wanted people to see. If your skin was darkened by the sun, it usually meant one thing. You worked outside, fields, farms, roads, long days under open skies. In other words, you were likely poor, a peasant, someone whose life was tied to labor. But if your skin remained pale, that suggested something very different. It meant you spent most of your time indoors, inside stone walls, inside large homes, protected from the sun. It meant you didn't need to work the land. It meant status wealth, a life of relative comfort. So pale skin became more than just a physical trait. It became a signal, a quiet but powerful message that said, I belong to a higher class. And in a world where class shaped almost everything, your opportunities, your safety, your future, that signal mattered a lot. Now, here's where things get interesting. Because not everyone was naturally pale, and when something becomes desirable, people find ways to achieve it, even if those ways are not exactly safe. Some people simply avoided the sun as much as possible, staying indoors during the brightest parts of the day, wearing long sleeves, covering their skin, using veils or hats when they went outside. It sounds simple, and in some ways, it was. But it also meant limiting your movement, your freedom. All for the sake of appearance. Others went a step further. They used early forms of cosmetics powders that could lighten the skin. At first glance, it might sound harmless, just a bit of makeup. But many of these substances were not what we would call gentle. One of the most common ingredients used for whitening was lead. Yes, lead. The same material we now know to be toxic. People would apply lead-based powders or creams to their faces to achieve that pale, flawless look. And for a while, it worked. Their skin appeared lighter, smoother, more refined, but over time, the effects could be severe skin damage, illness, long-term poisoning. In some cases, the very thing meant to create beauty ended up destroying it. It's a strange and quiet kind of irony, trying to look healthy by using something that slowly harms you. But in that world, the immediate appearance often mattered more than the hidden cost. Because again, appearance was not just personal, it was social currency. Now imagine walking into a room in a medieval court. People glance at you. They don't need to ask questions. They don't need to know your name. They look at your skin, and they already have an idea. Pale, likely noble, sun-darkened, likely working class. It's not perfect, of course. There are exceptions. But as a general rule, it was a quick and powerful visual cue. And in a society without modern IDs, profiles, or records, these cues were important. They helped people place you, understand you, judge you, and it wasn't just about class. Pale skin also became associated with delicacy, with softness, with a kind of refined femininity, especially for women. A pale woman was often seen as more elegant, more controlled, less exposed to the harshness of the outside world. Her appearance suggested that she lived a protected life, and protection, in that context, was tied to value. But again, there's that tension, because too much attention to maintaining pale skin could raise concerns. Was she vain? Was she too focused on appearance? Was she trying too hard? So even something as simple as skin tone had to be managed carefully, maintained, but not obsessed over, displayed, but not flaunted. It's a delicate balance. Now, let's shift perspective for a moment. Think about the people who could not achieve this ideal. Peasants, laborers, farmers. For them, avoiding the sun was not an option. Their lives depended on it. They worked long hours outdoors, day after day. Their skin told the story of that life. Rougher, darker, marked by exposure. And while that might not have matched the elite ideal of beauty, it carried its own meaning. Strength, endurance, capability. Within their own communities, these traits could be respected, even valued. So again, beauty was not one single thing. It shifted depending on where you stood. But across the broader medieval culture, pale skin remained one of the clearest markers of high status, one of the most visible signs that someone belonged to a different world, a world of stone halls, quiet chambers, and lives lived mostly out of the sun. Now, picture our noblewoman again. She sits in that candlelit room. The flame flickers softly. She reaches for a small container, dips her fingers lightly into a fine powder, then gently applies it to her face, blending it carefully, trying to create that smooth, pale finish. She leans in toward the metal mirror, searching for imperfections, adjusting, refining, all while knowing, at least on some level, that this is more than just a routine. It's a performance, a way of presenting herself to the world, a way of signaling who she is, or who she is expected to be, because in her world, skin was not just skin, it was a message, and every shade, every tone, every careful adjustment spoke volumes. Now, let's focus a little higher, just above the eyes, just below the hairline, a place we don't usually think about much today. But in the medieval world, it mattered more than you might expect, the forehead. Not just any forehead, a high one. In fact, one of the most unusual beauty standards of the time was the desire for a forehead that seemed taller, wider, and more open than what nature might normally give, and unlike pale skin, which you could protect or enhance. This one required something a bit more direct, plucking or even shaving. Yes, people, especially women in noble circles, would deliberately remove hair from the front of their hairline to make their forehead appear higher, slowly, carefully. Often strand by strand, it was not quick, it was not painless, but it was fashionable now. You might be wondering why. Why would anyone want to make their forehead look bigger? To us, it might seem odd, even a little extreme, but in the medieval mindset, a high forehead carried meaning. Just like pale skin, it was associated with intelligence, with refinement, with a kind of quiet elegance. A smooth, open forehead suggested a calm and controlled appearance. It framed the face in a way that felt balance, almost serene. And that mattered, because medieval beauty was not just about individual features. It was about harmony, proportion, the way everything came together to create a certain impression. A high forehead helped create that impression. It made the face look more elongated, more delicate, more noble, in a sense. And again, we see that same pattern beauty tied to status, to the idea of being elevated, both socially and visually. Now imagine sitting in that same dimly lit room. Our noblewoman leans forward again, but this time, instead of focusing on her skin, her attention moves to her hairline. She takes a small tool, maybe tweezers, maybe just her fingers, and she begins. One hair, then another. Each one removed with care. It's a quiet process, almost meditative, but also a little uncomfortable. There's no modern lighting, no perfect mirror, no precise tools, just patience, and a clear idea of what she is trying to achieve. A higher forehead, a more perfect face, and just like before, this is not just about personal preference. It's about expectation in noble circles. Trends like this spread quickly. If high foreheads are admired, then people begin to adjust themselves to match. And over time, it becomes normal, expected, even now. Here's something interesting. This idea of shaping the face, of altering natural features to fit an ideal, is not as distant from us as it might seem. Today, people contour their faces with makeup. They shape their eyebrows, they style their hair in ways that change how their face looks. Some even go further, with cosmetic procedures, different methods, different tools, but the underlying idea, very similar. Adjust what you have to match what is admired. In the medieval world, the forehead just happened to be one of the key areas. Now, let's look a bit deeper, because this wasn't only about fashion. It also connected to cultural ideas about the mind. The forehead, in many ways, was seen as a space linked to thought, to intellect. A larger, more open forehead could subtly suggest a more thoughtful, more refined person. Whether that was true or not didn't really matter. What mattered was the perception, and perception, as we've seen, was everything. Now, not everyone followed this trend. Like many beauty standards, it was strongest among the upper classes. Peasant women, for example, were less likely to spend time plucking their hairlines. They had different priorities, different lives. Time, energy, and survival came first. But among the elite, where appearance was closely watched and quietly judged, these details mattered. A lot, even small differences could stand out. A slightly lower hairline might be seen as less fashionable, less refined, not necessarily ugly, but not ideal, and in a world where people were constantly observing each other, those subtle differences could shape opinions. Now, let's pause for a moment. Think about the experience itself. Sitting still, plucking hair, watching your reflection shift, little by little. There's something almost ritual-like about it. A slow transformation, a careful crafting of the self, and again, we return to that idea. Beauty as performance. Not something you simply have, but something you build, maintain, adjust. Something influenced by the world around you, by trends, by expectations, by quiet social pressure. Now imagine stepping out after this process, walking into a hall, passing by others. They glance at you and maybe, without even realizing it, they notice. The smoothness of your forehead, the shape of your face, the way everything seems to align with what is currently admired. They might not say anything, but the impression is made, and that impression matters. Because in the medieval world, where identity was closely tied to appearance, even small details could speak loudly. So as strange as it might seem today, that high forehead was not just a fashion trend. It was a signal, a subtle, carefully crafted message about who you were, or at least who you wanted to be seen as. And like pale skin, it reminds us of something important. People have always been willing to change themselves, sometimes in uncomfortable ways, to fit the image their world tells them is beautiful. Now, let's move just slightly from the forehead into the hair itself. Because in the medieval world, hair was never just hair. It carried meaning, quiet signals, subtle messages, sometimes even rules. And just like skin and facial features, what your hair looked like and how you wore, it could say a lot about who you were. Let's start with color. In many parts of medieval Europe, especially in the north, one color stood above the rest. Blonde, soft, golden, almost glowing in the light. Blonde hair was often associated with youth, with innocence, with purity. It appeared again and again in stories, poems, and artwork. The ideal woman, especially in noble or romantic settings, was often described with fair skin and light hair. There was something almost symbolic about it. Light coloring suggested something untouched, something gentle, something closer to that ideal of moral purity we talked about earlier. But of course, not everyone was born blonde. And just like with pale skin, when something becomes desirable, people find ways to get closer to it. Some used natural methods to lighten their hair, herbal mixtures, plant-based rinses, even spending time in the sun, though carefully, so the skin didn't darken too much. It was a bit of a balancing act. Lighten the hair, but protect the skin. Not exactly simple. And results were not always perfect. Hair might turn slightly lighter, maybe a softer shade, but rarely the kind of golden tone that poems described so beautifully. Still, the effort mattered, because again, it wasn't just about achieving perfection. It was about moving closer to the ideal. Now, beyond color, there was texture and style. Long hair was generally preferred for women. It suggested femininity, health, vitality. But tanned, this is important, it was not always meant to be seen. In fact, how a woman wore her hair could reveal something very specific about her life. If her hair was loose and flowing, it often meant one thing. She was unmarried, young, possibly still under her family's care. Loose hair carried a sense of openness, of youth, of potential. But once a woman was married, things changed. Her hair was typically covered, not because it was unattractive, but because it was considered private, something reserved, a sign of modesty, a reflection of her new role in society. Head coverings became common: veils, wimples, various forms of cloth that wrapped around the head and neck. At first glance, they might seem simple, but they were deeply meaningful. They signaled respectability. They showed that a woman understood and followed social expectations. They aligned with the broader idea of modesty shaped by religion and culture, and just like everything else, there was a balance. A woman could still present herself well, still look elegant, but she had to do so within certain boundaries. Now imagine that shift. One day, your hair's loose, visible, part of your identity in a very open way. The next, it's covered, hidden, managed differently. It's not just a change in style, it's a change in status, in how the world sees you, and how you are expected to see yourself. Now, let's look at men for a moment. Male hairstyles also followed trends, though they were generally simpler. Hair length and facial hair changed over time. Some periods favored clean-shaven faces. Others allowed for beards. But overall, the expectation was moderation. Hair should be neat, controlled, not wild, not overly styled. Again, that same idea appears. Take care of your appearance, but don't overdo it. Don't cross into vanity. Now here's something subtle, but important. Hair was one of the few features people could actively change without too much risk. Unlike skin treatments with dangerous chemicals, or painful plucking of hairlines, hair could be grown, cut, covered, styled. It gave people a certain level of control, a way to adjust their appearance within the limits of their world. But even then, that control was guided, shaped by expectations, by what was considered appropriate for your gender, your class, your stage in life. So while hair might seem like a simple thing, in the medieval world, it was anything but. Now let's return one more time to our noblewoman. She has finished adjusting her forehead. Her skin is carefully prepared. Now she turns to her hair. She brushes it slowly, smoothly, making sure it falls just right. If she is unmarried, perhaps she lets part of it show. Soft strands framing her face. If she is married, she begins to cover it, wrapping fabric carefully, securing it in place. Every movement is deliberate, nothing rushed, because this is not just routine, it's presentation, it's identity. And just like before, she may not see herself perfectly in that polished metal mirror, but she knows the standard. She knows what others expect to see, and that's what she's working toward. Because in her world, hair is not just a personal feature, it's a language, one that tells others, quietly but clearly, who you are, where you stand, and how closely you follow the rules of the world around you. And as we continue, you might start to notice something. Every detail, skin, forehead, hair, it all connects. Each piece part of a larger picture, a system where beauty is not random, but carefully shaped, carefully read, and deeply, deeply meaningful. Now, let's gently step back, away from the face, away from the small, precise details, and look at the body as a whole. Because just like skin, hair, and facial features, the body itself carried meaning. And in the medieval world, the ideal female body might not look the way you expect. If you picture modern beauty standards, you might think of very specific shapes. Slim waists, defined curves, fitness-focused bodies. But medieval ideals were different, softer, subtler, and, in some ways, more symbolic than visual. The preferred female form was not extremely thin, nor was it sharply defined. Instead, it leaned toward a more natural, slightly rounded shape, a small chest, narrow shoulders, and perhaps most surprising of all, a gently rounded stomach. Yes, a visible softness around the midsection was not seen as a flaw. In many cases, it was a positive sign, because it suggested something important: fertility, health, the ability to bear children. And in a world where survival often depended on family, lineage, and continuity, that mattered more than almost anything else. So the body was not judged only by how it looked, but by what it represented. A woman's appearance could quietly signal her potential as a wife, as a mother, as someone who could contribute to the stability of a household. And again, we see that deeper pattern. Beauty tied to function, to meaning, to life itself. Now, this doesn't mean that appearance didn't matter in a visual sense. It did. But the ideal was less about extreme features and more about balance, proportion, harmony, a body that looked healthy, capable, and well-maintained, not overly thin, not overly large, just steady. Now, let's talk about clothing for a moment. Because in the medieval world, clothing played a huge role in shaping how the body appeared. There were no modern shapewear brands or advanced tailoring techniques like we have today. But that doesn't mean people didn't adjust their silhouettes. They absolutely did. Garments were designed to guide the eye, to create certain lines, to suggest certain shapes. Bodices, for example, could help create a more structured upper body. Layers of fabric could soften or emphasize different areas. Belts or ties could shift how the waist appeared. It wasn't exactly corsetry as we know it today, but it was a step in that direction, a quiet way of shaping the body through fabric. And once again, it wasn't just about personal taste. It was about fitting into a shared idea of what looked right. Now imagine how this would feel, getting dressed each day, pulling on layers of clothing, adjusting them carefully, making sure everything sits just so. Not too tight, not too loose, because every detail contributes to the overall impression. and that impression matters. Now let's return briefly to the idea of class, because just like with skin tone, body appearance could reflect social position. A well-fed body, soft-rounded, not worn down by hard labor, could suggest access to food, comfort, and stability. In contrast, a body shaped by constant physical work might look leaner, more rugged, more marked by effort. Again, neither is inherently better in a biological sense, but culturally, one was often associated with higher status, and that association influenced how beauty was defined. Now, here's something worth noticing. The medieval ideal did not demand perfection in the way modern standards sometimes do. There was no expectation of sharp definition or extreme proportions. Instead, there was a focus on natural appearance, a kind of quiet completeness, and part of that comes back to the influence of religion and morality. The body was seen as something given, something created, not something to be aggressively reshaped or exaggerated. So while people did adjust their appearance, there were still limits, boundaries shaped by culture and belief. Now, of course, not everyone fit the ideal, and just like today, that could affect how they were perceived. But the standards themselves were less about strict measurements, and more about general impressions. Does this person look healthy? Do they appear capable? Do they fit the expectations of their role? These were the kinds of questions, even if they were never spoken out loud. Now, let's return to our noblewoman one more time. She has prepared her face, adjusted her hair, covered what needs to be covered. Now she stands. Her dress falls into place around her, layers of fabric settling gently. She adjusts the fit slightly at the waist, smooths the front, takes a small step back. There is no full-length mirror, no perfect reflection to confirm the final result. But she knows the feeling, the way the fabric sits, the way it moves, the way it shapes her form, and that is enough. Because in her world, beauty is not just something you see clearly. It's something you understand through experience, through how you carry yourself, through how others respond to you, and through how closely you match the quiet expectations that surround you. So the ideal body is not just a shape, it's a signal, a reflection of health, fertility, status, and balance. And like everything else we've seen so far, it's part of a larger system, one that turns even the most natural parts of being human into something observed, something interpreted, something that quietly speaks. Now, let's shift the focus. So far, we've spent time with the expectations placed on women, the careful details, the quiet adjustments, the balance between beauty and modesty. But what about men? Did beauty matter for them too? The short answer is yes, just differently. In the medieval world, male beauty was less about delicate features and more about presence, strength, structure, capability. A man was not expected to look soft or refined in the same way as a woman. Instead, the ideal leaned toward something more solid. Broad shoulders, a tall, or at least upright posture, a body that suggested strength, even if it wasn't exaggerated. The kind of appearance that said, without words, I can protect, I can work, I can endure. Because for men, beauty was closely tied to function, especially in a society shaped by warfare, labor, and hierarchy. Now, imagine a knight. Not the polished, cinematic version we often see today, but a real one. He stands in armor. Yes, but underneath that, his body tells a story. Training, discipline, repetition. He is not styled for beauty in the modern sense. But there is still an ideal there, a certain image he is expected to match. Strong, but controlled. Capable, but not reckless. And importantly, not overly concerned with his appearance. Because here's where things get interesting again. Just like with women, there was that same quiet warning. Do not be vain. A man who spent too much time grooming himself, adjusting his looks, or focusing heavily on appearance could be judged, seen as weak, or distracted, or lacking seriousness. So once again, we find that balance. Look presentable, but don't make it obvious that you're trying. Now let's talk about grooming, because despite the idea that medieval life was rough and unpolished, men, especially those in higher classes, did care about how they presented themselves. Hair was kept in certain styles depending on the time period, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter. Beards came and went in popularity. In some eras, a clean-shaven face was preferred. In others, a well-kept beard could signal maturity and authority. But the key word here is well-kept, not wild, not neglected. Even if a man wasn't aiming for beauty in a decorative sense, he was still expected to look orderly, controlled, put together. Now think about posture. It might sound like a small thing, but it mattered. A man who stood straight, moved with confidence, and carried himself with purpose would naturally be seen as more attractive. Not because of a specific feature, but because of the overall impression. And that's a pattern we've seen before. Beauty as perception, as presence, as something that goes beyond individual details. Now, let's compare to men. One is a noble, the other a peasant. The nobleman likely has access to better clothing, better grooming tools, more time to maintain his appearance. His hands might be softer, his posture trained, his movements practiced. The peasant, on the other hand, lives a very different life. Long hours of physical work, exposure to the elements, less time and fewer resources for grooming. His body might be leaner, strong in a different way, marked by labor. Now, in terms of survival and real-world strength, the peasant might actually be incredibly capable, but in terms of perceived beauty, the nobleman often fits the ideal more closely. Why? Because once again, beauty is tied to status, to the image of control, refinement, and distance from hardship. Now here's something subtle but important. For men, beauty was often less about being admired and more about being respected. A beautiful woman might be described as lovely, graceful, delicate. A beautiful man, in medieval terms, might be described as strong, honorable, wealth-grown. The language itself shifts because the expectations are different. Now, that doesn't mean attraction didn't exist in the same way. It did. People noticed appearance. They formed preferences. They were drawn to certain looks. But those preferences were filtered through cultural ideas about what a man should be. And those ideas emphasized strength, control, and usefulness. Now, let's return to a quiet moment again. A man prepares for the day. He adjusts his clothing, maybe smooths his hair. If he has a beard, he checks its shape, makes sure it's not too wild. He doesn't spend too long, doesn't linger, because that might feel excessive. Instead, it's quick, practical, enough to look proper, enough to meet expectations, and then he moves on. Because in his world, appearance matters, but it must never seem like the main focus. Now, If we step back and look at the bigger picture, something becomes clear. Both men and women were shaped by beauty standards, but the direction of those standards was different. Women were often expected to refine, soften, and present beauty carefully. Men were expected to embody strength, stability, and restraint, to different paths, both guided by the same deeper forces: class, culture, religion, and both tied to the same idea we've been following all along: that beauty is not just about how you look. It's about what your appearance says, about your role, your place, your identity. So as we continue, keep that contrast in mind, because the medieval world didn't have one single definition of beauty. It had many, each one shaped by expectation, each one quietly telling people how they should appear, and who they should be. Now, let's slow things down for a moment, because there's a very common idea about the medieval world that we need to gently clear up. You've probably heard it before, that people in the Middle Ages were constantly dirty, that they never bathed, that the entire world smelled, well, terrible. It's a strong image, and like many strong images, it's only partly true. The reality is a bit more nuanced, a bit quieter, and honestly, a bit more human. Because medieval people did care about cleanliness. They just approached it differently. Now, let's start with bathing. Yes, people bathed, more often than you might expect. In many towns and cities, there were public bathhouses, places where people could go to wash, relax, and even socialize. Warm water, steam, conversations drifting through the air. It wasn't exactly a modern spa, but it wasn't far off either. For those who could afford it, bathing was a regular part of life. Even in smaller communities, people found ways to stay clean. Buckets of water, wooden tubs, simple routines. It wasn't always luxurious, but it was intentional. Now, of course, not everyone bathed every day. Water had to be carried, heated, prepared. It took time and effort, so bathing might happen less frequently than what we're used to today. But the idea that people simply ignored hygiene altogether, that's not accurate. Now, let's talk about soap. Medieval soap did exist. It was usually made from a mix of animal fats and ashes, simple, a bit rough by modern standards, but effective. People used it to clean their skin, their hands, and their clothes. There were also oils and herbal mixtures, some used for cleaning, others for scent, because yes, smell mattered too. Perfumes, in a basic form, were part of medieval life. Herbs like lavender or rosemary might be used to create pleasant scents, not just for luxury, but for comfort, for a sense of freshness. Now, here's where things take a slight turn. Over time, attitudes toward bathing began to shift, partly because of disease. As plagues and illnesses spread, some people started to believe that bathing, especially in public spaces, might actually be harmful. That warm water could open the pores and allow sickness to enter the body. So gradually, in certain places and periods, public bathhouses declined. People became more cautious. Bathing didn't disappear, but it changed. Less communal, more careful, and sometimes less frequent. Now, let's talk about oral hygiene. Because even here, people made an effort. They didn't have toothbrushes as we know them today, but they used what they had. Chewing sticks, cloths, herbal rinses. Simple methods to clean the teeth and freshen the breath. Were they perfect? No. Dental problems were still common. But the idea that people simply ignored their teeth completely is not quite right. They tried, with the tools available to them. Now, let's bring all of this together. Cleanliness in the medieval world was not absent. It was just different, shaped by available resources, by beliefs about health, by time and effort. And just like everything else we've explored, it was influenced by class. A noble household might have more access to water, servants, and bathing facilities. A peasant family might rely on simpler methods, but both still valued the idea of being clean, of presenting themselves properly. Now imagine stepping into a medieval town. You walk through the streets. There are smells, yes, animals, food, smoke. It's not the sterile environment we're used to today, but it's also not the overwhelming filth that's often imagined. People are washing their hands, cleaning their clothes, taking care of themselves in the ways they can, because appearance still matters, even in a practical world. Now, let's return to a quiet, familiar scene. Our noblewoman prepares for the evening. Before anything else, she washes hands, face, maybe even a full bath if the household allows it. Warm water poured carefully, steam rising gently. It's not rushed. It's part of the process. Because beauty does not begin with decoration. It begins with preparation, with cleanliness, with care, and from there, everything else follows. The powders, the hair, the clothing, all built on that foundation. So when we think about medieval beauty, it's important to let go of that simple myth that people didn't care about hygiene, because they did, deeply, just in a world where every action, every bath, every wash, every small routine required effort. And that effort, in itself, tells us something. That even in a time without modern convenience, people still wanted to feel clean, to look presentable, to meet the expectations of the world around them. And maybe, in that quiet way, they weren't so different from us, after all. Now let's move into something a little more unsettling. Because up until now, many of the beauty practices we've explored, adjusting hair, shaping the body with clothing, maintaining pale skin, have felt controlled, intentional, even gentle at times. But not all of them were. Some came with a cost. A quiet, hidden cost that wasn't always understood until it was too late. Because in the medieval world, the desire to appear beautiful could lead people to use substances that were, in truth, dangerous. Sometimes very dangerous. And yet, they were used anyway. Let's begin with something we've already touched on. Skin, that soft, pale, almost glowing complexion that signaled status and refinement. Achieving it naturally by avoiding the sun was one thing, but enhancing it, perfecting it, that often required more. So people turned to cosmetics, powders, creams, mixtures made from whatever materials were available. And one of the most common ingredients used to whiten the skin was lead. Yes, again. Lead was ground into fine powders or mixed into pastes and applied directly to the face. At first, the effect was exactly what people wanted. The skin looked lighter, smoother, almost flawless in the soft light of a room. Imperfections faded. Color evened out. For a moment, it seemed like the perfect solution. But the body remembers what the surface hides. Over time, lead begins to seep in. Slowly, quietly, it doesn't announce itself. At first, there might be small signs, irritation, dryness, a strange tightness in the skin. But then, something more serious. The skin could begin to deteriorate. Dark spots, cracking, a dullness that no powder could fully conceal. And beneath that, the deeper effects: fatigue, illness, poisoning. The very thing meant to create beauty begins to destroy it. And yet, even with these risks, the practice continued, because the pressure to appear a certain way did not disappear. If anything, it grew stronger. If pale skin was expected, then it had to be achieved, even if the method was imperfect, even if the cost was hidden. Now, lead was not the only substance used. Mercury also found its way into certain beauty treatments, used in creams meant to smooth the skin or reduce blemishes. And just like lead, mercury had its own quiet dangers, absorbed through the skin, affecting the body over time, creating problems that people did not fully understand, but still, it was used. Because in that moment, standing in front of a mirror, or what passed for one, the result mattered more than the risk. Now let's shift slightly, because not all cosmetics were quite so harmful. There were also natural dyes and pigments used to add color. For the lips, for example, subtle touches of red or pink, often made from crushed plants or berries. These were softer, less dangerous, but still used carefully, because once again, there was that balance. Adding too much color could be seen as excessive, too bold, too attention-seeking, and that could lead to judgment. So even something as simple as coloring the lips had to be done with restraint, just enough to enhance, not enough to stand out too much. Now imagine the process. A small container sits nearby. Inside, a fine powder or a thick cream. The noblewoman dips her fingers lightly, applies it to her face, blends it slowly, watching through that imperfect reflection as her skin changes, becomes smoother, paler, more aligned with what is expected. But there's something quiet beneath the surface, a kind of tension, because she may not fully understand the risks, but she may have heard whispers, stories of skin turning fragile, of beauty fading in strange ways, of people who tried too hard and paid for it. And yet, she continues, because stopping would mean stepping away from the ideal, and that comes with its own consequences. Now, let's think about this in a broader sense. Why would people use something harmful for the sake of appearance? It's easy, from a modern perspective, to say they didn't know better. And in some ways, that's true. Medical knowledge was limited. The long-term effects of these substances were not fully understood. But there's something deeper here, something that still feels familiar. The idea that beauty is worth effort, worth discomfort, sometimes even worth risk. We see echoes of that even today. Different methods, safer tools, ideally, but the same underlying drive, to match a standard, to fit an image, to be seen in a certain way. Now, let's return to the medieval world, because cosmetics were not just about changing appearance, they were about control. In a life where many things were fixed or class, your role, your future appearance, was one of the few areas where change was possible. Limited, yes, but still possible. You could lighten your skin, smooth your face, add a hint of color, adjust, refine, present. It gave a sense of agency, even if that agency came with risks. Now, it's also important to remember that not everyone used these products. Like many beauty practices, They were more common among the wealthy, those who had access to materials, time, and the social pressure to maintain a certain image. Peasant communities relied more on natural appearance, simple care, basic cleanliness, less emphasis on artificial enhancement, but the ideal, the image of pale, smooth, refined beauty still existed. And that ideal influenced everyone, even if they couldn't fully achieve it. Now imagine a gathering, a hall filled with soft light, people moving quietly, speaking in low voices, faces pale, carefully prepared, hair arranged just so, clothing layered and precise. At first glance, everything looks calm, elegant, but beneath that surface, there's effort, there's maintenance, there's a quiet awareness of what it takes to look this way, and in some cases, there's sacrifice, because beauty in this world is not effortless. It's constructed, maintained, sometimes at a cost that is not immediately visible. Now, let's pause for a moment, because there's something almost paradoxical here. The medieval ideal often emphasized natural beauty, purity, simplicity, modesty, and yet achieving that natural look often required artificial means, powders, creams, careful adjustments, a kind of crafted naturalness. It's a contradiction, but also a very human one, wanting to appear effortless while putting in effort behind the scenes. Now, as we move forward, keep this in mind, because this chapter reveals something important. Beauty standards are not just about what is admired. They are about what people are willing to do to reach that ideal. And sometimes, that willingness leads into dangerous territory, quietly, gradually, without clear boundaries. So the next time you picture medieval, beauty-pale faces, smooth skin, calm expressions, remember what might be hidden beneath the powders, the mixtures, the careful, repeated routines, and the risks that came with them. Because in that world, beauty was not just something you were born with, it was something you created, even if the process came at a price. Now, let's move beyond the body itself, beyond skin, hair, and all the careful adjustments we've seen so far. Because in the medieval world, there was something just as powerful, sometimes even more powerful than physical appearance. Clothing, not just as protection from the cold, not just as something practical, but as a language. A very precise, very visible language that told people exactly who you were, before you ever spoke a word. Imagine walking into a medieval town square. You don't know anyone there. No introductions, no names. But within seconds, you already start forming impressions. That person, fine fabric, deep color, clean lines, likely wealthy. That person, simple cloth, faded, practically a laborer. You don't need confirmation. The clothing does the talking, and in many cases, it speaks loudly. Now, in today's world, fashion can be flexible. People mix styles, break rules, experiment. But in the medieval world, things were far more controlled. There were actual laws called sumptuary laws that dictated what people could and could not wear. These laws were designed to maintain social order, to make sure that class distinctions remained visible, clear, undeniable. For example, certain fabrics like silk or fine velvet were reserved for the upper classes. Rich dyes, deep reds, vibrant blues, royal purples were often restricted as well. If you were not part of the nobility, you simply were not allowed to wear them, not because you couldn't afford them, but because you weren't supposed to. Clothing, in this sense, became a controlled signal, a way of reinforcing hierarchy, and beauty was tied directly into that system. Because what was considered beautiful was often defined by what the elite wore: elegant fabrics, flowing garments, carefully structured silhouettes. These became the standard, not necessarily because they were universally appealing, but because they were associated with power. Now, let's talk about fabric for a moment, because texture mattered a lot. Rough wool might be common among peasants, durable, practical, warm, but not particularly soft, not particularly refined. In contrast, the wealthy had access to smoother materials, fabrics that moved differently, caught light differently, felt different against the skin, and that difference was visible, even from a distance. Now imagine the experience of wearing such clothing, layers of fabric, carefully fitted, not rushed, not thrown together, but arranged, adjusted, almost composed. A noblewoman might spend a significant amount of time getting dressed, not because she had many options, but because each piece had to sit just right. The way the fabric fell over the shoulders, the way it gathered at the waist, the way it moved when she walked. All of it contributed to the final impression, and that impression, once again, mattered. Now, let's look at structure, because clothing didn't just cover the body, it shaped it. Subtly, quietly, a fitted bodice could create a more defined upper body. Layered skirts could add volume or softness. Belts could shift the perceived position of the waist. These weren't extreme transformations, but they were enough to guide the eye, to suggest the ideal form we talked about earlier: balanced, proportional, controlled. So even if someone's natural body didn't perfectly match the ideal, clothing could help bridge the gap. Now, let's consider color, because color was not just decorative, it was symbolic. Deep red, for example, could suggest wealth and importance. Blue might be associated with certain virtues or religious symbolism. Bright, rich colors often required expensive dyes, which meant only certain people could wear them. So when you saw someone dressed in vibrant tones, you weren't just seeing a fashion choice. You were seeing status, resources, access, and again, this connects directly to beauty, because what looked beautiful was often what looked rare, what looked expensive, what looked difficult to obtain. Now imagine two women standing side by side, one dressed in simple, undyed fabric, the other in layered garments of rich color and fine texture. Even if their natural features were similar, the perception would likely be very different, because clothing amplifies, it enhances, it frames the body in a way that changes how it's seen. Now let's not forget jewelry. Small details, but powerful ones. Rings, brooches, necklaces. Not worn in excess, but chosen carefully. Each piece adding to the overall image. Each one quietly signaling wealth and refinement. And just like everything else, there were limits. Wearing too much could be seen as excessive, as trying too hard. So even in decoration, there was that familiar balance: enhance, but don't overwhelm. Now, let's return to daily life. Getting dressed in the medieval world was not always a quick process, especially for those in higher social classes. It could involve assistants, servants helping to layer garments, adjust fit, secure fastenings. It was almost ceremonial, a daily act of preparation, of presentation. Now imagine our noblewoman again. She stands as her garments are arranged. fabric placed carefully over her shoulders, tied, adjusted, smoothed. She lifts her arms slightly as layers settle into place, then lowers them, feeling the weight, the structure. She takes a step. The fabric moves with her, not randomly, but in a controlled, graceful way. And in that moment, she is not just dressed, she is presented to the world. Because clothing, in her world, is not just about comfort, it's about identity. It tells others where she belongs, what she represents, how she should be treated. Now, let's shift perspective again. For a peasant, clothing is different, simpler, more practical, designed for movement, for work, for durability. There is still care involved. Clothes are cleaned, repaired, maintained. But the focus is not on signaling status. It's on survival function. And yet even here, appearance still matters. In smaller ways, in how neatly clothes are kept, in how they are worn. Because even in the most practical settings, people still care about how they are seen. Now, when we step back and look at all of this, something becomes very clear. In the medieval world, beauty was not just built on the body, it was built around it, through fabric, through color, through structure, through rules. And those rules were not optional, they were part of the system. A system that made sure everyone could be seen, understood, and placed, almost instantly. So when we talk about medieval beauty, we cannot separate it from clothing, because clothing was one of the most powerful tools people had to shape perception, to express identity, to align themselves with the expectations of their world. And like everything else we've seen, it required effort, awareness, and a constant understanding of where you stood. Because in that world, what you wore was never just what you wore. It was who you were. Now, let's step away from the halls of nobility, away from layered silk, careful powders, and quiet rituals of refinement, and move into a different world. A simpler one, at least on the surface. Fields stretching into the distance, dirt paths, wooden homes, the steady rhythm of daily labor. This is where most people lived. Because despite all the focus on nobles and courts, the vast majority of the medieval population were peasants, farmers, laborers, craftspeople, people whose lives were shaped not by fashion trends, but by survival. And in this world, beauty looked very different. Not absent, not unimportant, just different. Because when your day begins at sunrise and ends only when the light fades, your priorities shift. There is less time to stand in front of a mirror if you even have one. Less time to carefully shape your appearance. Less access to the materials that made elite beauty possible. So instead of crafted beauty, you find something more natural, more grounded, more tied to the body's ability to function. Now imagine a woman working in the fields. Her hands are rough from labor. Her skin has been touched by the sun, day after day. Her hair is tied back, not for style, but for practicality, to keep it out of her face, to keep it from interfering with her work. At first glance, she might not match the refined ideals of noble beauty. Her skin is not pale. Her features are not softened by powders or carefully arranged fabrics. But that does not mean she is not considered beautiful, just in a different way. Because within her community, different qualities are valued. Strength, endurance, health, a body that can work, that can sustain effort, that can handle the demands of daily life. These are not just practical traits. They are attractive, in a quiet, grounded sense. Now, think about what beauty means in this setting. It's not about signaling wealth, because most people share a similar level of resources. It's not about following strict fashion laws, because clothing is simple, functional, often handmade. Instead, beauty becomes something more immediate, more personal, more connected to everyday experience. Does this person look healthy? Do they have energy? Do they carry themselves with confidence? These things matter, even if they are not spoken out loud. Now, let's talk about clothing in this context. Peasant clothing is practical. Wool, linen, simple fabrics, often undyed or dyed in muted tones using natural materials. The goal is durability, protection from weather, ease of movement, not visual impact. But that doesn't mean people didn't care. Clothes were still maintained, repaired when damaged, cleaned when possible. Because even in a practical life, there is still a desire to present oneself well, to appear orderly, to show care. Now imagine a small village gathering. People come together after a long day, maybe for a meal, maybe for conversation. There is no grand display of wealth, no rich fabrics or elaborate designs, but there is still awareness. People notice each other. They see who looks strong, who looks tired, who carries themselves with ease, and attraction still exists. Preferences still form, but they are shaped by different standards. A strong back might be admired more than delicate features. A steady, capable presence might be more appealing than perfect symmetry. Because, in this world, beauty is tied closely to life itself, to the ability to contribute, to endure, to survive. Now, let's consider something else. Access. Many of the beauty practices we've discussed, cosmetics, structured clothing, careful grooming, require resources, time, materials, money. Peasants often had limited access to these things. So even if they were aware of elite beauty ideals, they could not fully participate in them. And over time, that creates a kind of separation to parallel standards. One shaped by wealth and refinement, the other shaped by practicality and necessity. Neither completely replaces the other. They exist side by side. Now, here's something subtle but important. Even though peasant beauty standards were different, they were not completely isolated. Ideas from the upper classes could still influence broader culture. Stories, art, and passing interactions could spread certain ideals. So a peasant might still recognize pale skin as noble, or long, flowing hair as beautiful, even if those traits were not central to their daily lives. This creates an interesting tension between what is admired and what is possible. Now imagine a young woman in a village. She has heard stories of noble courts, of women with pale skin and fine clothing. She might picture that world, maybe even admire it. But her own life is rooted in something else, in work, in community, in reality. So her sense of beauty is shaped by both, by distant ideals and immediate experience. Now let's return to the body again, because in peasant life, the body tells a very clear story. Muscles developed through labor, skin marked by sun and weather, hands shaped by years of work. These are not hidden, they are visible, and they carry meaning. They show what a person has done, what they are capable of, and in a world where survival depends on effort, that matters deeply. Now, let's pause and compare this to the noble world. In elite settings, beauty often signals distance from labor. Pale skin, soft hands, controlled movement. In peasant life, beauty often signals the opposite: connection to labor, strength through effort, endurance over time. Two very different messages, both valid within their own contexts. Now imagine our noblewoman stepping briefly into a village. Her pale skin, her structured clothing, her refined appearance would stand out immediately. She would be seen as different, not just in status, but in the kind of beauty she represents. And if a peasant woman were to step into a noble court, her strength, her sun-touched skin, her practical clothing would also stand out, perhaps not fitting the elite ideal, but still carrying its own kind of presence, its own kind of story. Now, let's return to a quiet moment. A peasant woman finishes her day. The sun is setting. She washes her hands, maybe her face. Simple, but enough to feel clean. She adjusts her clothing slightly, smooths it out. There is no long preparation, no careful layering of cosmetics, but there is still awareness of how she looks, of how she is seen, because no matter the class, people care. They always have. Now, when we look at medieval beauty as a whole, this chapter reminds us of something important. There was no single standard, no universal ideal that everyone followed in the same way. Instead, there were layers, different worlds, different expectations, each shaped by the realities of daily life. And within those worlds, beauty still mattered, still influenced perception, still played a role in relationships, in opportunities, in identity, just expressed differently. So as we continue, keep this contrast in mind, because understanding medieval beauty is not just about looking at the elite, it's about seeing the full picture, from candlelit chambers to open fields under the sun, and recognizing that in every setting, in every life, beauty found a way to exist, quietly, naturally, and always, meaningfully. Now, let's move into something even more personal, because up until now, we've looked at beauty as a signal, a reflection of status, of morality, of identity. But here, beauty becomes something else, something more direct, something with real, tangible consequences. Marriage. In the medieval world, marriage was not just about love. In many cases, it wasn't about love at all. It was about alliance, about stability, about building connections between families, securing resources, and ensuring survival across generations. And within that system, beauty mattered a lot, because beauty could influence who you married, and who you married could shape your entire life. Now imagine being part of a family in the medieval period. You are not just thinking about your own future. You are thinking about your place within the family, your role, your responsibilities. And if you are a young woman, your appearance becomes part of that equation. Because when it comes time for marriage, people notice, they observe, they evaluate, not always openly, but very clearly. Does she look healthy? Does she appear capable of bearing children? Does her appearance reflect good upbringing, good character? These are the kinds of questions that quietly shape decisions, even if they are never spoken directly. Now, let's talk about something important. Dowries in many parts of medieval Europe. A woman's family would provide a dowry money, goods, or land to accompany her into marriage. This was part of the arrangement, part of the negotiation, but beauty could still influence how that arrangement played out. A woman considered attractive might receive more attention, more interest, perhaps even better marriage prospects, because beauty, once again, acts as a signal. It suggests health, fertility, good fortune, and in a system where families are trying to secure the best possible future, those signals matter. Now, let's be clear. Beauty was not the only factor. Family status, wealth, connections, all of these played major roles. But appearance was part of the overall picture, a visible, immediate part. Now imagine a gathering, a feast, a social event, a place where families come together. Young women are present, so are potential suitors, or at least the families who will make decisions. Glances are exchanged, observations made, quiet judgments forming. How does she carry herself? Is her appearance in line with expectations? Does she reflect the kind of image a family wants to bring into their household? Again, it's not loud, not dramatic, but it's constant. Now, let's shift perspective for a moment, because this is not just about women. Men, too, are part of this system. A man's appearance can influence how he is perceived as a potential husband. Does he look strong, capable, healthy? Does he present himself in a way that suggests stability? But again, the expectations differ slightly. For men, beauty is often tied more closely to strength and reliability. For women, more closely to fertility and refinement. Two different sets of expectations, both shaped by the same larger system. Now, here's something interesting. Despite the structured nature of medieval marriage, attraction still existed. People still noticed each other, still formed preferences, still experienced moments of connection, even within arranged systems. And beauty played a role in that. A glance across a room, a moment of recognition, a quiet sense of being drawn to someone. These things didn't disappear. They simply existed alongside the more formal arrangements. Now, let's return to our noblewoman. She is no longer just preparing her appearance for general social life. There is something more specific at stake. Her future, her place, her potential role as a wife. Every detail now carries extra weight. Her skin, her hair, her posture, the way she dresses, the way she moves. All of it contributes to the impression she creates, because that impression could influence decisions made by others, decisions that shape her entire path. Now imagine the pressure to appear not just beautiful, but appropriately beautiful. Not too bold, not too plain, not too distant, not too eager, balanced, refined, in line with expectations. Because stepping outside those expectations could have consequences. Too much emphasis on appearance might suggest vanity. Too little might suggest neglect, and either could affect how she is perceived. Now, let's look at peasant communities again, because even there, where marriages might be less formal, beauty still plays a role. People still notice health, strength, energy. A person who appears capable and well presented might be seen as a better partner, because marriage, even at this level, is tied to survival, to shared work, to building a life together. So while the system is less formal, the underlying ideas remain. Beauty as a signal, beauty as a reflection of potential. Now, let's consider something deeper. In a world with limited mobility where people often remained within their social class, marriage was one of the few ways to change your circumstances, to improve your position, or at least secure it. And beauty could influence that opportunity. It could open doors, or quietly close them. Now, This doesn't mean that someone without conventional beauty had no chance. Far from it. Other factors mattered greatly. Character, skill, family connections. But appearance was still part of the equation. Always present, always observed. Now imagine the emotional side of this. Standing in a room, aware that you are being seen, not just as a person, but as a potential match, a future partner, a piece in a larger arrangement. It creates a certain kind of awareness, a quiet tension. Because beauty, in this context, is not just about self-expression, it's about expectation, about fitting into a role that has already been defined. Now, let's return to a quieter moment. Our noblewoman sits once more in her chamber. The candle burns low. She has finished preparing for the day, or perhaps for an evening gathering. She looks at her reflection, or what she can see of it, and for a moment there is stillness, because beneath all the routines, all the adjustments, there is a simple question: am I enough? Not just in appearance, but in what that appearance represents. Will it lead to the future expected of me? Will it help secure my place? Because in her world, beauty is not just about being admired, it's about being chosen, and that changes everything. Now, as we step back and look at this chapter, something becomes clear. Beauty in the medieval world was not just aesthetic, it was functional. It played a role in one of the most important systems of the time: marriage, family, continuity. And through that system, beauty became something more than a personal trait. It became a form of value, a way of signaling potential, a factor in decisions that shaped lives. So as we continue, keep this in mind, because every standard we've explored so far leads, in some way, to this point, where appearance is not just seen, but evaluated, not just admired, but weighed, and where something as simple as how you look can influence the path your life takes. Now, let's slow things down again, because so far, much of what we've explored has focused on ideals: pale skin, smooth faces, balanced features, carefully arranged hair. But real life, as we know, doesn't stay perfect for long. Time moves, bodies change, and in the medieval world, those changes were often more visible and more difficult to hide. So what happened when beauty faded, or shifted, or was interrupted by something unexpected, like a scar, an illness, or simply the passing of years? Let's begin with aging, because aging, in any time period, brings change. But in the medieval world, it came faster. Life was harder. Nutrition was less consistent. Medical care was limited. And daily life, especially for peasants, placed constant strain on the body. So signs of aging could appear earlier. Wrinkles forming sooner. Skin losing its smoothness. Hair thinning or changing color. These were natural changes. But in a culture that valued youth, especially for women, they carried meaning. A young woman was often associated with fertility, potential, and beauty. As she aged, those associations shifted. Her value in the marriage market, as we explored, could decrease, not because she lost all worth, but because the expectations around her changed. Now, that doesn't mean older women were ignored or unimportant. Far from it. They often held knowledge, experience, authority within the household or community. But in terms of physical beauty, as it was narrowly defined, youth was still the standard. And once again, we see that tension between what is valued socially and what is valued aesthetically. Now imagine looking into that same imperfect mirror. But this time, you notice something new. A line that wasn't there before. A slight change in the skin. It's subtle, but it's real. And in a world where beauty carries meaning, even small changes can feel significant. Now, let's talk about something even more immediate. Scars. In the medieval world, injuries were common. Work accidents, falls, fights, even simple daily tasks carried risk. And without modern medicine, even small wounds could leave lasting marks. Scars on the hands, arms, face. Visible reminders of past events. Now, how were these scars viewed? It depended. For men, scars could sometimes carry a certain meaning, a mark of experience, of survival, even of strength, especially if connected to battle or physical labor. A scar might tell a story, something endured, something overcome. But for women, the perception could be different, especially when it came to visible scars on the face, because female beauty, as defined by the culture, leaned heavily toward smoothness, softness, unbroken skin, so a scar could disrupt that ideal, not necessarily ruin it, but alter it, change how a person was seen. Now imagine a young woman who once fit the expected ideal, smooth skin, balanced features, then an illness or an accident, and suddenly there is a mark, something permanent, something that cannot be easily hidden. In a world without advanced cosmetics or treatments, that mark becomes part of her identity, something others notice, something she becomes aware of again and again. Now, let's talk about disease, because this is where things become even more complex. The medieval world faced many illnesses, some mild, some devastating, and many of them left visible traces. Skin conditions, marks, discoloration, even diseases like smallpox could leave lasting scars across the face and body, changing appearance in ways that were impossible to ignore. Now imagine the emotional weight of that, not just dealing with illness, but with how it changes how others see you. In a society where appearance carries meaning, these changes can affect perception, social interactions, even opportunities. And yet life continues. People adapt. They find ways to move forward. Now, let's return to the idea of concealment. Because even though tools were limited, people still tried to manage these changes. Simple cosmetics, clothing adjustments, head coverings, anything that could soften or hide visible differences. But unlike earlier beauty practices, this was not about enhancement. It was about preservation, trying to hold on to an image that was slowly shifting. Now, let's pause and consider something deeper. Imperfection. In the medieval world, just like today, perfection was an ideal, not a reality. No one truly matched it completely, but the expectation still existed. And when someone fell outside of it, whether through aging, injury, or illness, they were seen differently. Not always harshly, not always unfairly, but noticeably, and that difference mattered. Now, let's look at the community aspect. Because while elite beauty standards were strict, everyday life was more flexible. In smaller communities, people knew each other. They understood each other's stories. A scar was not just a flaw, it was a memory, a sign of something that had happened, a part of a person's life. And in that context, appearance could be seen with more depth, more understanding, more acceptance. Now imagine an older woman in a village, her hands worn from years of work, her face lined with time, perhaps a scar or two, She may not fit the youthful ideal, but she carries something else: presence, experience, a kind of quiet authority, and within her community, that can be just as meaningful. Now, let's return one last time to our noble woman. But now, she is older. The candlelight still flickers. The room is the same, but she is not. She sits before the same polished metal mirror, leans in slightly, and sees the changes, subtle but undeniable. She might adjust her appearance, apply a bit of powder, arrange her clothing carefully, trying to maintain the image she has always known. But she also understands something now, something that comes with time. That beauty, as it was once defined for her, is not fixed. It shifts, it fades, it transforms, and in its place, something else begins to emerge. Not always celebrated in the same way, but present nonetheless. Now, as we step back from this chapter, something becomes clear. Medieval beauty was not just about achieving an ideal. It was also about dealing with what happens when that ideal changes, when time moves forward, when life leaves its marks. Because no matter how carefully beauty is constructed, reality always finds its way in, through age, through experience, through the simple passage of time. And in that sense, the medieval world reflects something deeply familiar. That beauty is never permanent. It evolves, it fades, it shifts, but it never completely disappears. It simply takes on new forms, sometimes quieter, sometimes less visible, but still meaningful, still human. Now, let's gently widen the lens again, because so far, we've been speaking as if medieval beauty was one single system, one shared set of ideas. But the reality is a bit more layered, because medieval Europe was not one place. It was many. Different climates, different cultures, different daily lives. And all of those differences shaped how beauty was understood. So what was considered attractive in one region might not be exactly the same somewhere else. Let's begin with something simple: the environment. Because climate plays a quiet but powerful role in shaping appearance. In northern parts of Europe, cooler, less intense, sunlight-pale skin was easier to maintain, and as we've seen, it became a strong marker of status and beauty. But move further south, where the sun is stronger, the days warmer, and things shift slightly. Skin tones naturally vary more. Exposure to sunlight is harder to avoid. So, while lighter skin might still be admired, the contrast between classes may look a bit different. The ideal doesn't disappear, but it adapts. Now, imagine a woman living in a northern region, long winters, soft light, less direct sun. Her skin remains naturally pale. She fits the ideal almost without trying. Now imagine another woman in a southern region, warmer climate, brighter days. Even if she avoids the sun, her skin carries a different tone, a different warmth. Neither is wrong, but the expectations around them shift subtly. Now, let's talk about lifestyle. Because not every region lived the same way. In some areas, life was more rural. In others, more urban. Cities, in particular, created different conditions. More trade, more interaction between people from different places, more exposure to new ideas, and with that, new influences on beauty. In a busy medieval city, you might encounter people with different styles, different fabrics, different grooming habits, and over time, those differences blend, slowly shaping local trends. Now, let's bring in another layer. Cultural exchange, because medieval Europe was not isolated. Trade routes connected it to other parts of the world, including regions of the Islamic world, which at the time had advanced knowledge in areas like medicine, hygiene, and cosmetics. Through trade, ideas moved, not all at once, not everywhere equally, but gradually. Certain beauty practices, like the use of perfumes, oils, or more refined grooming techniques, were influenced by these exchanges. New materials appeared, new methods spread, and local cultures adapted them in their own ways. Now imagine a merchant returning from a long journey, bringing with him not just goods, but ideas, stories of different customs, different ways of presenting oneself. Those ideas don't stay isolated, they circulate, they influence, and over time, they become part of the local understanding of beauty. Now, let's talk about fashion again, because clothing styles could vary significantly between regions. In one area, garments might be heavier, designed for colder weather. In another, lighter, more breathable. The shape, the layering, the movement of clothing, all of it changes with environment. And as we've seen, clothing plays a major role in shaping beauty. So when clothing changes, the ideal changes with it. A silhouette that looks elegant in one region might feel impractical in another. A fabric that signals wealth in one place might not even be available in another. Now imagine walking from one region to another. At first, everything feels familiar, but then you start to notice small differences. The way people dress, the way they style their hair, the way they carry themselves. Nothing dramatically different, but enough to stand out. And those small differences matter, because beauty is often defined by what feels normal within a specific place. Now, let's consider something else. Language and storytelling, because ideas of beauty were not only shaped by physical reality, but also by stories. Local legends, poetry, songs, these forms of expression often described ideal figures, beautiful women, handsome men, and those descriptions could vary. In one region, certain features might be emphasized. In another, something slightly different. Over time, these descriptions reinforce local standards. They create a shared image, a mental picture of what beauty looks like. Now, let's return to the idea of class for a moment, because even within the same region, differences still exist. Nobility versus peasantry, urban versus rural. These layers interact with regional differences, creating a complex system, not one single standard, but many overlapping ones. Now imagine two noble women from different parts of Europe meeting. At first, they may seem similar, both well-dressed, both carefully prepared. But as you look closer, there are differences in fabric, in colored choices, in subtle details of grooming, each reflecting the culture they come from. And yet, they can still recognize each other as part of the same broader world. Because despite regional variation, there are shared ideas, shared foundations, especially when influenced by common forces like religion and class structure. Now, let's return to a quiet scene. A woman stands at the edge of a marketplace, but this time, the marketplace is full of travelers. Voices in different accents, clothing in slightly different styles, colors that seem just a bit unfamiliar. She watches, observes, notices how others present themselves, and perhaps, without even realizing it, her own idea of beauty shifts, just a little. because exposure changes perception, even in subtle ways. Now, let's step back and look at the bigger picture. Medieval beauty was not fixed. It was fluid, shaped by environment, by culture, by interaction. And while certain core ideas like the link between beauty and status remained consistent, the details could vary, from region to region, from city to village, from one community to the next. Now, this might seem like a small point, but it matters, because it reminds us that beauty is never universal. It is always shaped by context, by the world people live in, by what they see every day, and by what they learn to value over time. Now imagine looking at a map of medieval Europe, not as a set of borders, but as a network of influences. Ideas moving slowly across distances, changing as they go, adapting to new environments, creating variations of the same underlying themes. And within that network, beauty takes many forms, all connected, but never exactly the same. So as we continue, keep this in mind, because when we talk about medieval beauty, we are not talking about a single image. We are talking about a collection of images, a mosaic, each piece shaped by its own place and time, and together, they form a much richer, more complex picture than any single standard ever could. And just like that, we've reached the end of our journey through medieval beauty. From pale skin and high foreheads to the surprising and, sometimes extreme ways, people tried to fit these ideals. It's clear that beauty back then was about much more than just appearance. It was tied to status, belief, and even survival. But now, I'm curious, what do you think? Which medieval beauty standard surprised you the most? Or seemed the strangest? Let me know down in the comments side. Love to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, don't forget to like the video, it really helps the channel grow. And subscribe for more fascinating stories from the past. And if you're not ready to leave just yet, check out the next video on your screen. We've got more hidden history waiting for you there. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.